What if I told you the story of the PlayStation that almost killed Sony? Because yes, with almost 30 years of existence, the PlayStation brand has had countless successes, but also some resounding failures. The biggest of them, for sure, is the PlayStation 3. And the arrival of the machine led to record losses for the brand and internal layoffs. It's simple, for a while PlayStation lost its crown to Xbox, but to understand how we got here, we have to go back to the basics of everything when the PlayStation 2 was released. So that's what I'm going to tell you in this new episode of Digital Tales. Our story begins in 2000 with the launch of the PlayStation 2. The machine was an immediate success. It was a huge gaming and entertainment platform that embodied Sony's golden age at the beginning of the millennium. Despite the competition, especially Nintendo, Sega, and Microsoft, PlayStation proves to the whole world that it is the real boss of the sector, a clever and efficient leader that offers nothing less than the gaming platform par excellence. Convinced of its assets, Sony quickly thought about the future and began working on a third home console, the PlayStation 3. And to design it, the company analyzes what works and what pleases in the PS2 formula, namely the multimedia thanks to the DVD player and the extraordinary gaming experience. Taking this into account, the PS3 will have to become the media center of tomorrow while offering a breathtaking video game experience. So that's kind of what the shopping list of the designers who are working on the future console look like, while the PS2 is selling like hotcakes. And as you will see, for this third home console, Sony is going to play very big. The bosses of Sony's gaming division, including Ken Kutaragi, the mastermind behind this new machine, decided that the PS3 would have to knock out any form of competition, so he wants to reinvent the hardware of game consoles from top to bottom, and that means a computing chip that no one will be able to match, the Cell, the processor of the future machine that will also be his tombstone. With such a vision of technological excellence in mind, Sony is looking for allies, so the Japanese giant is joining forces with IBM and Toshiba to design a monster, the Cell, a next-generation microprocessor designed and manufactured with the hope of becoming the leading architecture of the future. So I reassure you right away that we are not going to go into the details, which are very complex, but overall it is a system that is made up of several entities that manage each of the very precise points of the rendering and calculation of an application. What you need to remember is that video games are ultimately only one of the many areas in which the Cell must excel, because yes, it is also designed to do medical imaging, seismic analysis, astrophysics, or even very, very high efficiency calculations. And if it seems weird for a game console processor 15 years later, in fact it worked a bit, and some scientists did not hesitate to connect dozens and dozens of PS3s together to form supercomputers. That's how sweeping and versatile the processor was. Except that wanting to be hyper-competent everywhere, it is difficult to be excellent somewhere. And on the video game side, you'll see it, the Cell will show itself not very docile. In addition to being extremely expensive for Sony, which has invested $400 million in research and development, the Cell is going to be a real problem for developers. The processor architecture is not very practical for the simple reason that it is very far from PCs. And plot twist, the majority of games are developed first on PC and then adapted to the specificities of consoles. So when a studio develops a game for consoles, it should have as few changes to make between versions to focus on its creativity. If you ask him to work for hundreds of hours on an ultra-secret documentation in order to master the optimization of a single architecture that he can't necessarily understand, well, it results in games that go wrong. And precisely the PS3 games that are on other platforms also run less well on PS3 than on Xbox 360, while Microsoft's machine is almost half the price and it was released a year before, and the PlayStation 3 will naturally suffer from the situation. There are even some star developers who will be very aggressive towards Sony's decisions. Gabe Newell, for example, the boss of Valve, a luminary in the world of development, is not going to mince his words. As soon as the PS3 was released, he said about it, "The PlayStation 3 is a waste of everyone's time," before letting go about the famous Cell processor. I think he should cancel it and redo it from scratch. Very harsh words, but which convey well the struggle in which Sony and the developers found themselves in the early years of the PS3. But for the team behind the PlayStation 3, it is the public that must be convinced above all even if it means tackling the competition. Ken Kutaragi, again the boss of the project, will say, for example, with a lot of aplomb, the PlayStation 3 is not here to be released in a hurry or to exploit gimmicks. This is a barely camouflaged double attack on the Xbox 360, released 1 year before the PS3 and on the Wii, which relies on motion gaming, therefore qualified as a gimmick. Translation: at PlayStation, we are not here to string pearls. We play seriously, and if you want excellence, you will have to wait for it and pay the price. And the price, let's talk about it, because that's also where the PS3 almost weighed down Sony. As we have seen with its PS3, Sony attempted the heist of the century to discredit any form of competition thanks to its new generation CPU, which is super expensive. However, with costs exploding, the console is simply too expensive to produce. More than $800 X factory? That's colossal. Of course, gamers are not ready to pay that much, and Sony must therefore lose money on each machine sold to sell its PS3. The rate that the consumer will have to pay is therefore reduced, but it is still very high. $600. Yes, I know, that's a lot, and it has even become a psychological ceiling that must never be reached again. We therefore thank the PS3 for officially setting this limit in the industry. Look at this numbers, for example. They presents the prices of the consoles when they are released and the price they would have in 2020, taking inflation into account. This means that your PS3 of the time, you would pay more than $772 today. It's not very far from the price of a Neo Geo, which is in common memory an overpriced console. But Sony defended this price rather clumsily with off track in the middle of an interview like, players won't mind working a few more hours to afford excellence. But where it sticks even more is that this very high price, it denies PlayStation's DNA. Because remember, 10 years earlier at E3 1995, when Sony presented the first PlayStation, it was a communication master class. Remember the announcement of the price in the best way possible? $299. And yes, a $299, thank you and good evening. It was the final blow against a Sega Saturn positioned $100 more expensive. 10 years later, the facts are there. The Saturn is dead, but the PS3 repeats the same mistake of price positioning. So how did we arrive at such a price? I'll tell you right now. To justify such a high price, Sony is taking out its Joker card. As I told you, the PlayStation 3 was designed as the logical evolution of the PS2, so it's also a media center. And if the PS2 had democratized the DVD a few years earlier, the PS3 will have the difficult task of democratizing the Blu-ray, a support of the future for Sony, which is also the owner of the format. By having the leading machine and making this new disc format indispensable, Sony hopes to achieve a big coup. Unfortunately, if the objectives are clear and are there, the enthusiasm is not really there. It must be said that the gap between the video cassette and the DVD was gigantic in the early 2000s. 5 years later, to think that we have to swap our record collection for other more qualitative but more expensive records, it's obvious to anyone. Also, the PS3 is also betting a lot on the advent of high definition on the image side. And in fact, in the first years of the console's launch, HD-ready and full HD TVs were not yet very widespread. As a result, neither the display nor the support, which are two big arguments of the PS3, are priorities for the consumer of the time. And as if that wasn't enough, the other side of the coin is that this choice of Blu-ray is putting Sony in trouble on the production side, because initially the console was supposed to be released a year earlier in order to be head-on against the Xbox 360 at the end of 2005, but by sheer bad luck, the launch was postponed by several months because of a very small diode that was out of stock and was linked to the famous Blu-ray player. This small diode, this tiny little part that costs only 5 very small cents at the factory, delayed the launch of the console, putting it in a dangerous competitive position. And with all these problems, Sony had to change its plans in a hurry between the time the PS3 was unveiled and the time it was released. Changes that, as you will see, are not slight. In 2005, when Sony presented its PS3, the public discovered a domed and massively multimedia-oriented machine. You only have to look at the connectors on the machine at the time to realize this. There are 6 USB ports, 2 HDMI ports for video, a slot for SD cards, a slot for flash cards, we don't even know why, an AV jack for old TVs, and a digital audio port for sound. That's far too much, and in the minds of analysts and consumers, it's not necessarily what you expect from a game console. After all, here we will pay a high price for all this, and all this only a handful of users will really use it. And then there's this controller, the Boomerang, which doesn't look good by all accounts. The worst thing is that it totally changes the form factor, the look of the DualShock, the mythical controller that has accompanied PlayStation players since the first console. Faced with the scathing criticism following this first PS3 conference, Sony revised its copy and presented the following year a console with less and with a new controller. For the latter, it is the return of the usual form, but there is a big absence, the vibration. Indeed, it is then 2006, and Sony has already perceived the interest of motion gaming, which will be introduced by the Wii, and is trying to surf on the same wave by integrating motion sensors into its own controller. The DualShock thus becomes 6-axis. We can imagine it. It was done at the last minute, because remember, a year earlier the controller was the Boomerang with vibrations that go well and 0 motion gaming. The problem is that Sony's engineers can't make vibration and motion gaming coexist, and so for several years the PS3 controller will not vibrate. In the eyes of the general public, we are therefore removing an essential and very appreciated feature to replace it with this famous gimmick that Sony had openly mocked a year before. For the record, only a handful of games will benefit from this 6-axis motion detection feature. Again, this contributes to the bad start of the PS3, so what to do? What do you do when you arrive late, too expensive, with a super complex architecture for developers, with a Blu-ray player that is struggling to impose itself, and with a controller that doesn't vibrate? Well, the answer is simple. We keep a low profile and we take the blows. When the machine was launched, faced with production and supply difficulties, the PS3 was mainly talked about for the crowd movements it generated. The media interview a lot of people who often have only one desire: to buy it to sell it at a higher price. And yes, the famous scalpers who made a lot of noise during the COVID, they were already there in 2006. Unfortunately for Sony, during those years, the losses accumulated, as you can see on this graph. I remind you, with each console sold, Sony loses money. Nearly $240 on each machine. In the console business, it's a bit normal at the beginning, and the more you advance in time, the less expensive the machine is to produce. But here, for the time being, the PS3 is making Sony lose a lot of money because of the manufacturing cost, which is abnormally high. The loss that all this represents is normally absorbed by game sales, but there still needs to be enough of them. And with an entry ticket of $600 and faced with a catalog that is not really sexy and not really well optimized, players are quite cautious about their game purchases. This double phenomenon, harmful to the brand, will therefore lead to record losses for Sony, which will go up to $4.7 billion in losses overall. Jobs were destroyed. There were dozens of redundancies in some of the brand's branches. In short, the launch was a disaster. Meanwhile, everything is going well at Xbox, and the American brand even allows itself a little getaway on a barge in front of the Parisian launch party of the PS3 just to say, "We're here, we love you, come to us." Faced with this extremely unfavorable configuration, PlayStation has only one move to play, that of exclusives. Sales leadership was lost, the brand's image had to be urgently restored, and the following years of the PS3's sad life were marked by challenges and unexpected success. Until 2009, it was extremely hard for the PS3, but from that year, everything changed. They start by changing the visual identity of the PS3 logo, which used to be the typography of the Spider-Man movie. As if we wanted to say to players, we get it, you want video games, not a media center that is too expensive, you're going to be served. It is therefore after 3 years of ordeal that a complete overhaul of the machine arrives. thinner, less noisy, and sold for $300. In this way, Sony is trying to erase the mistakes of the launch and is embarking on a new era by chasing success. And as we have seen, Sony will chase after this success by betting fully on a hyper-involved and hyper-efficient studio network. And they are the ones who will learn to master the cell, this unfortunate processor that made multi-platform titles so unpleasant to play on PS3. These studios, which only work for Sony, will sand the documentation of the processor and get help from the architects and engineers who designed the PlayStation 3. This allows during this period remarkable releases that will forge the second life of the PS3 with an incredible catalog. God of War 3, The Last of Us, Metal Gear Solid 4, infamous Uncharted, Heavy Rain, and many more. It is all these games that still make the prestige of the PS3 Air today, erasing all the mistakes Sony made on this generation. And as a symbol of a bygone era, it was also in 2009 that IBM abandoned the idea of working again on the cell processor. The revolutionary chip will therefore be remembered as a monster of power, which certainly gave life to the famous exclusives we have just mentioned and much more, but which also almost killed PlayStation and Sony. A year later, in 2010, Sony began to focus on subscriptions and their profitability by launching the PlayStation Plus, a program that will make it possible to never again find ourselves in extremely loss-making fiscal years, a memory that will remain forever linked to the PS3. With successes and new models to perfect the console, the PS3 will somehow manage to surpass the sales of its rival, the Xbox 360. As soon as it was overtaken, Sony let the world know it in 2013, just in time to announce the PS4, the queen of a generation during which this time it is Xbox that will fail all along the line, but that's another story that I'll tell you very soon. So that concludes our digital tales on the failure of the PS3. Obviously, I had to sort and select a lot of events and info. Don't hesitate to tell me what you thought in the comments and what your favorite PS3 game is, but above all, thank you to you who are still here. Do not hesitate to give feedback and subscribe. Stay tuned.